Hi, everybody. My name is David Hewson. I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Remo First. Thank you for joining us today. Remo First, we are an employer of record. We help companies hire in 150 countries around the world by putting in place locally compliant employment contracts and handling contractor payments and all of the aspects of compliance with global hiring. We work with Fortune 500 companies and some of the best startups around the world to help enable them hiring global remote teams. We appreciate you joining today's webinar. We're going to be talking about managing the risks of building a global remote team. We're a bit biased, but we believe that there are immense advantages to building global teams, but the fact remains that hiring is a complex practice, whether you're doing it right in your backyard or you're doing it across multiple countries and having to manage the nuances of all of those different jurisdictions. So we're here to talk about that today. We want to provide you some actionable actionable recommendations for things that you can apply as you go out and build your remote workforce. And to do that, we have some amazing partners with us today. We have our partners from Verimark, and we have Jeremiah Chow representing Verimark. Jeremiah is the head of sales and client development at Verimark, and we're excited to hear his insights about building and managing the risks of a remote workforce. With that, Jeremiah, I'm going to hand to you if you don't mind introducing yourself and Verimark, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Dave. So, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Excited to be here to talk about our topic. As Dave said, I'm Jeremiah Chow. I head up sales at Verimark. We help the world trust faster through automated background checks, and we help employers conduct background checks across 180 countries worldwide, essentially helping you mitigate your hiring risks. You just want to make sure you hire the person you are indeed hiring and not someone else.
Excellent. We appreciate that. And in the spirit of remote work, by the way, Jeremiah is speaking to us from Auckland, New Zealand today, and I'm here on the East Coast of the United States. So it is a miracle that we were able to find a time that works for both of us, but also I think really true to the theme of today's discussion. But to jump right in, Jeremiah, I would love to hear your thoughts on, what are some of the advantages, but also what are some of the risks associated with hiring a remote workforce in general?
So the first one is actually the access to a wider range of talent pool, right? If you are in a location like New Zealand where there's just 5 million people in it, the skilled workers you need may not all be there. So hiring remote enables you to tap talented people, not just in the country you're working on, right? That's one of the big things. And obviously, if you are in a high cost country, hiring someone equally qualified at a lower cost base can really help you maximize your budget for that headcount. So really lots of stuff that you can leverage when you do hiring remotely. What are your thoughts on this, Dave?
Yeah, I think we tend to agree. I mean, I think from our perspective, people in general, we think workers are telling their employers that this is how they prefer to work, and in terms of how it impacts their home life or in terms of their ability to be productive in a less distracting environment. There are all sorts of reasons why we see the benefits of this. We agree wholeheartedly in the idea of the expanded talent pool and certainly some of the cost savings that are available. And so, yeah, in general, we definitely agree. On the risk side, however, I'd be curious to know, do you think that there are inherent risks in a remote workforce that are different than the risks of just hiring a team in your own backyard or just in general, like building a team in an office, for example? Or are those risks overstated?
Yeah, so there are downside as well, or risks that you have to be aware of when you do remote hiring. One, you're not able to meet the actual person face to face, right? So if a person tells you, I'm Jeremiah Chow, this is my profession at this location, how are you sure that that person is really who he claims he or she is?
Mm,
So we are seeing in our business that 1 out of 5 candidates have discrepancies when we conduct background checks,
wow.
and that could be anywhere from the wrong identity to stretching their qualifications or even claiming that they graduated at a certain university, but then when we reach out to that university, that person did not graduate from that educational institution. So lots of risks that employers need to be aware of that you can easily mitigate by running a thorough background check on your candidates.
Interesting. So 20%, so 1 in 5 of the candidates that you're screening, you're finding those discrepancies. What are you gave a couple of examples there, but what are some other examples of the kinds of discrepancies that employers are encountering?
So as a candidate, you always want to put your best foot forward, right?
Mhm.
And then that can mean some of them really stretching the truth. So
Mhm.
for example, let's say I claim that I've worked at this company for 3 years, but
Mhm.
then when we conduct the employment verification, the employer informed us that this person actually worked here for 2 years and 1 month.
Mhm.
So that's a stretch of around off from 2 years to 3 years. So
Mhm.
when you talk about that 11-month gap, what has the candidate been doing during that time? Right.
Mhm.
We found in some instance where the candidate actually jumped to another company, but only stayed there for 4 months because the
Mhm.
candidate was fired due to negligence, right? But
Mhm.
then obviously the candidate wouldn't want to reflect that on his or her CV. So the truth was stretched so
Mhm.
that that part of his employment history won't be uncovered, which present a red flag to the potential employer.
Of course, yeah. And I think one of the aspects of remote that makes this risk maybe higher is that we're probably all used to hiring, like if I were to hire someone here in Boston, in all
Mhm.
likelihood, I'd hire someone that is at least connected to my personal network, or I'd have personal relationships with individuals who have maybe worked with that person in the past. And while some people have very great networks that may extend globally, it's hard to believe that everybody you hired on your remote team would be somebody that you could make that kind of direct connection with. So I feel like the importance then of identifying and mitigating risks in the form of background screening is all that more important in the case of a remote team.
Yeah. And if I may add, it's one way you can potentially spot scammers as well. Like we
Mhm.
are seeing with some of our clients, let's say one of the hot tech jobs that companies are hiring for would be developers in
Mhm.
general. So there is an incident where someone posing as a developer would apply to a company, obviously very good at interviewing, will pass the interview process, get a job, and then request for the tools of trade. Like the company would issue a work laptop, which isn't cheap, right?
Mhm.
Maybe anywhere from $500 to $1,000 in
Mhm.
on average. And then once the candidate receives the tools of trade, he'll start ghosting the employer,
Mhm.
essentially go, AWOL,
Mhm.
sell the laptop for a fraction of the price. He made money out of it, and then do the same thing with another company.
Wow. Wow, and I guess in the example, not to downplay the impact of losing $1,000 or $2,000 from a laptop, but maybe even more sophisticated scammers that are also getting access to intellectual property, customer lists, or other data, and making off with that information in an interview process or after being hired. Are you seeing those kinds of examples occurring as well?
Yeah, we those are some of the questions our clients ask us, right?
Yeah.
Why they want to engage with a company such as ours.
Mhm.
So the cost of a bad hire is very expensive, anywhere from 3x to 5x of that employee's monthly salary. So why not invest a little, like 1% or 2% of that total cost per hire, just to make sure everything checks out well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we agree. I mean, I think it's not a controversial statement to say that people are one of the most valuable assets that an organization have. They also are the most expensive asset when you mentioned that sort of 3x or 5x of the cost of the hire being factored in when it comes to onboarding, training, providing enablement and support, and then the recruitment cost as well. I mean,
Yeah.
finding these people is hard enough, so you want to make sure that you can find the right people and retain them properly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's another aspect of this that when it comes to remote hiring that let's say that you've actually identified the right candidate and then you've gone through the process of doing the proper screening and now you're at a point where you want to hire that individual. The risk doesn't stop there, in the sense that you want to hire that person in a compliant way. You want to ensure that the employment contract that you put in place is compliant with local law. And I think in the same way, people maybe have a tendency to overlook some of the risks associated with the screening part of the process. They also sort of brush past this and think that they can handle it the way they handle it in their home country or whatnot. And as a result of that, they fall afoul of local laws. And we're going to talk about some of the nuances of doing background screening globally. But one of the points of working with someone like Remo First or Verimark is to partner with organizations that have already kind of thought through some of these risks, and you can avoid them yourself rather than sort of just plowing ahead, and letting speed get in the way of you running a good process. There are just so many ways you can create risk for your business. You can create risk with that hire, potentially lose the candidate if things aren't handled properly. So that's why we obviously recommend that the people partner with great experts when they're making these types of decisions. With that, I'd be curious to understand background screening. I'm sure is not one size fits all. I imagine if someone's hiring in one country and that it can be relatively straightforward, but obviously with the types of clients we support, they're hiring across multiple geographies, multiple regions. Are there nuances people should be aware of when it comes to hiring across multiple countries as it relates to background screening?
Yes, short answer is yes. So since we screen in over 180 countries worldwide, we have to comply with 153 data privacy legislations, and that's a lot.
Yeah.
So what works in a country won't necessarily work in another, right? For example, in the US, you can do a basic criminal check and a comprehensive criminal check, but then you go to a country like Singapore, for example, where criminal check is not permissible for pre-employment. Like the police will give you a certificate if you are applying for adoption, for visa, but just for pre-employment, it's not, the practice isn't common in that part of the world. So just knowing that helps you as an employer to think about, okay, how can I screen this candidate properly? In our case, we advise our candidates doing a criminality check, like global criminal databases and an adverse media, for example, in Singapore, because if you did something horrible, it shows up in the news. So there are some ways we can advise best practices with clients on doing checks depending on the country where they want to hire from.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned data privacy as a component of that. We have a lot of clients that are either headquartered themselves in the EU, or maybe they're headquartered elsewhere, but they're hiring within the EU. Are there maybe more stringent requirements that you need to be aware of as it relates to data privacy for background screening in those locations?
Yeah, well, the good thing is, at least when you talk about the European Union, GDPR is a commonly accepted standard in terms of data privacy, and different countries will just adopt or be similar to how GDPR is structured. So you just have to be weary of the nuances. Like in some countries, you can't, there are restrictions if you want to do a credit check, for example, just because credit information is considered very sensitive information. So just have to be aware. And obviously, if you partner with a reliable provider, then they can advise you on what is permissible and not permissible in that jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about some of the risks associated with like not handling this properly, I think a lot of times we put it in the context of, well, you could make the wrong hire, or you could bring someone onto your team that could create risk for the business. But I think you and I were talking previously about the fact that for some businesses, this is actually a requirement they have as a part of the various regulations that they're managed under. So what are maybe some examples of that you come across?
Yeah, so typically, if you are in a financial services industry, it's a very regulated industry, and before you actually onboard someone, that country would require you to conduct various checks, just to make sure, like if you're working in a bank, you don't want to employ someone who's been on the anti-money laundering watch list of the government, right?
Yeah.
So some industries, they are mandated to actually do these checks before they hire, so which is good, but then not everyone is doing background checks. And as everyone is more open to remote hiring, hybrid work, it's just added insurance to making sure you're hiring the right person for the role.
As we think about best practices, I mean, are you seeing employers that are maybe extending offer letters that are contingent upon background screening, is that like a generally acceptable practice that you've seen amongst your clients?
So we've seen two broad approaches from our client base. One is the conditional onboarding, right?
Mhm.
Because there is pressure to get the candidate starting right away.
Of course.
Some would put in a conditional onboarding where if certain checks are done, like you're not part of the global watch list, your criminal check is okay, then you can start. And then there are certain checks that really take a longer time to be conducted, like
Mhm.
an employment verification or an education verification. Then the once those two are finished, that's the time you're like fully onboarded. But
Mhm.
then, as I mentioned earlier, there are just some industries where the risk of not complying is so great that they want to make sure all checks are cleared before the
Mhm.
candidate is gets to start on the job.
Right. Yeah, you brought up a good point, which is time, and I think every hiring process I've ever been a part of, as either as the hiring manager or as the candidate, everybody wants to move fast, right? You're afraid of losing that great person, but in actual fact, some of this stuff does take time, as you said. What are some of the reasons why, or like what type of amounts of time should people budget in their hiring process to maybe get through a full screen?
Okay, that's a good question and quite a difficult question to answer. Typically, we advise clients will need 15 working days to get a full suite of checks done.
Okay.
The longest checks that take to complete are typically employment verification and
Mhm.
academic verification, simply because we are very dependent on the third party to respond.
Right.
With education verification, for example, in some countries like the United States, you have a central database of the graduates.
Mhm.
So it's easy to conduct that checks. But outside the United States, we actually have to reach out to the actual universities or education institutions and
Mhm.
get them to respond.
Right.
And when you consider these education institutions, it's not it's not the most exciting things in their to-do list, right? They're
Yeah.
understaffed, they have a lot of things to do. So some of them would take a lot of follow-ups before they respond. Some of them actually dedicate, oh, I'm going to respond to everything on the 28th of this month.
Right.
If you miss that cutoff, you have to wait for another month.
Mhm.
So as much as we want to do our best efforts to getting a response for them, we are entirely dependent on the third party to respond. Hence, why some of those checks take a longer time to complete.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think you mentioned that in some cases you may have to actually physically, appear at a location in order to get access to some of the
Mhm.
databases or whatever. And maybe in the case of criminal checks in some countries, is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. With some countries, they're just not as sophisticated as in other countries. So we have to send someone from our team to physically go to that
Wow.
government office to do the verification, which
Got it.
obviously adds a lot of extra time in terms of completing that check.
Yeah, yeah, and I know you guys have done a great job at automating as much of the process as possible in terms
Yeah.
of ordering checks and putting all of that in place. But as you said, sometimes you're at the mercy of those local offices or universities or whatever it may be. So that's interesting.
I have a question, Dave. Like to
Yeah,
flip the question. So
yeah,
obviously, in terms of getting the candidate to start sooner
yeah,
from your end, I would assume that in some countries, if they want to set up business, they would set up an entity and that it will take 1 to 2 months to be completed. But then you
yeah.
help them actually get started sooner rather than later. Like,
Yeah.
how are you doing it?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up exactly the right point. So setting up an entity in some of these countries can be quite time consuming. And in this example of, you needing to show up in an office to do a check, the same thing happens when you're setting up an entity. Some people have to physically arrive at an office in a country in order to register the entity. Sometimes there's share capital that has to be deposited in that new entity that requires them to physically carry cash into a government office to be able to fund the shares of that entity. So there's so much complexity involved with it, and it does take quite a while. And so what the employer of record model allows companies to do is take advantage of existing infrastructure in those countries. So they're coming to us, and there's already an entity there that is ready to hire people into that entity tomorrow. And we've onboarded people in effectively the same day by the time we get the MSA signed, and we can turn around an employment contract the next day. In reality, it still takes 5 to 7 business days to get everything in place and draft compliant employment contracts. But we also have the benefit, as I know you do as well, of saying, look, we've already hired 15 people in Singapore in the last month, and so this is just the 16th person we're hiring there. We're quite good at it, and so you can take advantage of that that rinse and repeat style, even though every hire is a bit unique, obviously. But yeah, interesting. Good. Well, we want to talk about, or continue to talk about some of the best practices. I think a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you is that I know there are actually a very broad range of types of checks that you can do on a candidate. You've mentioned a couple. You talked about adverse media, you talked about education checks, and so on. Are there kind of a standard set of checks that most organizations would want to go through prior to hiring somebody?
So it depends on the role the company is hiring. The package they will run will really be dependent on the role. Like, for example, if you're a logistic company and then you want to hire a fleet of drivers, you want to make sure that they have a valid driving license, right? Because the worst thing could happen is that one of your drivers gets into an accident and then you find out their driving license isn't valid. So you open up a big liability on your firm just because you didn't conduct the check. So this is an example of a driving license check. But then if you're hiring someone who's just going to be a developer, a programmer, is there really a need to do a validity of his or her driving license? Probably not, right? We talked about employment verification earlier, but then if you're hiring a fresh graduate, he or she doesn't really have any past employers. So the checks you want to run is very dependent on the role you're looking to fill and whether that is a regulated role. One common gap that we're seeing is that we may hire you, let's say, as an admin person at the beginning, and then fast forward 3 years later, you get promoted to someone in HR, right? So you move from an admin position to an HR, which has access to sensitive information. So that move could be potentially a risk because when you hired the person, you screened that person for an admin role, and then now you're moving the person into a sort of regulated role because he or she has access to sensitive info. You need to conduct a separate checks to make sure that the person is fit for that role, right? And it might not be HR; it could be that person moving into finance. So does the person have the required qualifications or any red flags to make sure that there won't be any problems later on?
And then for some of the more high level checks, I think you talked about KYC, anti-money laundering. Are there some of these checks that are almost immediate, like where you can have kind of same day results on certain candidates?
Yeah, so like a global sanctions checks typically can be done within the same day. It's a global shared databases of more than 100 countries in terms of law enforcement, regulatory enforcement, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
A common check that's quite popular since COVID would be a social media check, especially with the hire of remote workers, right? So you just want to make sure the person doesn't have any reference to maybe drugs, sex, guns, violence on their social media. Like if you're hiring a teacher, and then when you do a social media check, that teacher has some very racist comments on their profile. Like, do you really want to hire someone like that? So it's better to have that conversation up front and manage the hire at that point versus the candidate already started, they're already part of your organization, and then you find out that's what's happening.
Interesting. So one of the things I'm curious about is that there are obviously like sort of different levels of flags, I'm sure, that you can deliver back to employers, ranging from maybe some fairly obvious like criminal activity that would be a complete non-starter for an employee. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you talked about maybe discrepancies where someone said they worked someplace for 2 years and actually it was only a year and a half.
Yeah.
What recommendations do you have to employers to try to assess that feedback and how they might think about how to apply that in the interview process?
Right. So for us, we don't we just give the data that's been
Right.
asked for us to conduct, right?
Mhm.
It depends on our employer's internal HR policies on
Mhm.
how they want to handle that candidate depending on the discrepancies found.
Mhm.
We can share, best practices from other clients, but we don't really want to be in the business of, advising what they want to do based on the discrepancies found.
Yeah.
Like if you found that someone did not declare a certain employment,
Mhm.
because later on you find out he or she got a sick mother, he had to take care of the parent. uh, you know
Mhm.
I think there's a humanitarian angle
Yeah.
there that you have to consider. On the flip side, if a candidate says, oh, I graduated from this university like January 2022,
Mhm.
or January 2002, for example, and then you find out that he actually graduated March 2002.
Mhm.
There's a 2-month discrepancy, but then that happened over 20 years ago.
Right.
People forget, so it's not a big deal at that point. So it's dependent on the internal HR policies of that company. We can
Mhm.
advise what our clients have done, but we can
Yeah.
only give the data being asked, and we don't want to interpret the data.
Yeah. Makes sense. Do candidates ever run into like just mix-ups on names? I know you gave some examples of, if someone's name is Robert Williams or something that's quite common in a particular market, you could run into mix-ups. So how do you guys mitigate the potential of, maybe accusing a candidate of something they weren't guilty of, for example?
Yeah, so let's say we have a candidate called William Smith, right?
Mhm.
And some people would call William Will,
Yeah.
and then others would call him Bob. And then
Right.
sometimes the person would have various IDs, where I have a Will Smith ID, I have a William Smith ID. So part of the things we do when you do a thorough background check is checking for other matches potentially.
Mhm.
So if you just do a criminal check on William Smith, maybe you won't be able to find anything. But the more checks you add, like if you add a social media check on top of that, for
Mhm.
example, a
Mhm.
comprehensive background check, you will be able to uncover those links on the candidate, and then you can investigate further. What's the real story of this one.
Yeah.
So it ties into just having an internal policy of the types of checks you want to run,
Mhm.
depending on the role you're looking to hire.
Got it. Okay. Any other best practices before we move off of this that you'd like to recommend, or maybe examples that you've seen from existing clients that they should think about?
It's not really in our line of business of background checks, but in general, have a formal interview process.
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
you don't want to do is the candidate having 3 interviews where the 3 persons were all asking the same questions,
Right.
and then or even just winging it, right? Your interviewers winging it and then say, oh, how was Jeremiah interview? I think it's okay, I like him as a person, but did you actually do a thorough interview on the competencies
Mhm.
needed to succeed in that role? So I
Mhm.
think one of the big um, internal assessment employers could do is, do you have a formal hiring process, do you have a hiring scorecard, just to make sure you're looking at candidates objectively,
Mhm.
right, before advancing them in your hiring funnel.
Yeah. That is such a good recommendation. And I think one of the aspects of that we think a lot about for our clients is when they're hiring across geographies. So if it's a US headquartered company or a UK headquartered company, let's say, and they're hiring in Latin America or
Mhm.
Asia, really trying to understand prior to that interview, what are the important things they should know about hiring in that market? Because as you know, for every one of those interview processes, the candidate is interviewing the company just as much as the company is interviewing the candidate. And if you can't
Yeah.
answer simple questions like how are you going to employ them in that location, or what would you provide in terms of basic benefits, or how are you going to handle compensation, those are things that I assume for a lot of candidates would be showstoppers for them in terms of understanding whether they want to work with that organization. So yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of the importance of that, and then both from just a process standpoint, but also a pure educational standpoint. So
I want to add to that, Dave, of considering having employers consider what the candidate experience will be in
yeah.
the hiring process, right? Is it
Yeah.
pleasant? Do you want a candidate to go through hoops before they get employed, right? Uh, candidates now have a lot of options, right? If
Mhm.
you make it very difficult for them,
Right.
they're gonna drop out and just work with someone else.
Yeah.
Unless you're this really big logo that everyone wants to work at.
Yeah.
Not a lot of us have that benefit. You
Mm.
just have to consider providing a positive candidate experience for for the people you want to hire.
And I imagine a part of that, as it pertains to background screening specifically, is educating the candidate at the very start of the process that this will be a step in the process, right? I think it's candidates become concerned about these things or frustrated with these types of things when they find out about it late in the game. Maybe they feel they've already earned the position or been offered the job, and then it's like, oh, by the way, we're going to do a background screen on you at this point. But if, as you said, you have like a clearly documented set of steps on how to interview a candidate or what questions you want to run through, and then this is a part of the step, then they can be aware of that from day one, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. What we are getting some questions from the audience, so I'm going to jump into that. I have them in the chat here, and I can probably address some of these as well. But what are some trends that you see, in the current remote hiring landscape? I think just in our opinion, the remote workforce and the concept around building remote teams is going to continue to grow. But maybe what are some changes that employers can expect? But any trends you can speak to would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, from our perspective, is really validating the candidate you're hiring, like who is really the candidate you're hiring. And obviously, I'm quite biased that employers should run background checks, but the first step to actually hire is people are very good at interviewing, and then you just want to peek under the hood to say that person is really who he says he is, and then you run the necessary checks depending on the role so that there are no red flags and it's an easier integration into your workforce rather than finding out later on, oh, this is a problematic employee, and then when you started reaching out to past employers or supervisor, you get validation, but then that person is already in your company, so it's much more difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Um, yeah. And I don't know that I have much to add to that topic as far as trends, other than, from our standpoint, there are so many great enabling tools and technologies and services now to allow people to hire globally that, that's part of the reason why we see this trend continuing is that, whether it's Verimark, organizations like Remo First, or many other organizations, there's a lot of innovation that has happened to say, hey, we know what some of the risks are as it relates to building a global team. Let us address those risks, mitigate them for you, and through a partnership can help you do it in a way that ultimately grows your business as opposed to creating liabilities for it. So that's certainly a trend that we're seeing. One of the things I'm curious about, just to build off of that, background screening, is this an HR responsibility, or is there a specific function within the organization that is usually tasked with thinking about these kinds of things as part of the hiring process?
So typically it's HR, and it can sit with the recruitment function or on the onboarding function.
Yeah.
But then we also have clients where the function sits with compliance, especially
Mhm.
with regulated industries where they need to conduct rescreening every X number of months,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because when you do a background check, that's a snapshot of that point in time. Like
Mhm.
if you're hiring me as a driver, for example, I have a valid license now, but then if you rerun the check six
Mhm.
months later, I might be involved in an accident already in the next 6 months, or for some reason, right? And then you just want to make sure you check regularly so that all your employees are okay and
Yeah.
there's no risk for the company.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, one of the other audience questions we had was, how does an EOR actually help to mitigate remote hiring risks? So I'm happy to take that. And then Jeremiah, if you have any perspective on it.
Yeah.
One of the ways I would answer that in the context of today's discussion is that one of the most popular ways in which a lot of companies will think about engaging remote talent globally is through independent contractor relationships. I think people have maybe incorrectly assumed that hiring independent contractors is fine because the contractor's okay with it and the employer's okay with it, and everybody's happy, and you don't have to go through a lengthy contract process and whatever else. The risks that we've talked about today, though, whether it be really identifying that independent contractor is who they say they are, that they aren't going to create risk for your business, I think people have a tendency to skip those steps because you think independent contractor relationships should be easier. Also, as it pertains to how EORs can help, in a lot of countries, independent contractor relationships are simply just not compliant. If this person is working for you 40 hours a week, if you're providing them tools of the trade, like Jeremiah said, like providing them a laptop, for example, if you expect that they're going to work for you and only you and not work for some of your competitors, those are all things that actually define an employment relationship. And so an EOR provides you that, more cost-effective and faster way, frankly, to get those people hired rather than going the independent contractor route. I also think for the most part, people would feel they shouldn't do a background screen on an independent contractor, for example. But in fact, I imagine you guys probably do quite a bit of that, Jeremiah. But in general, that would be one way in which I would say we could help mitigate risks. But any thoughts on that one, Jeremiah?
Yeah, I like the point you brought up where it's obviously easier, and some companies might think it's more cost effective just to hire someone to be a contractor. But then depending on the jurisdiction and laws of that country when it comes to contractor, you may not be able to dictate what the contractor should or should not do. And if ever a problem will arise in the future, and you go to a court, it will be found out that while you hire that person as a contractor, the relationship is in fact an employer-employee, and you're more into big trouble than what you originally signed up for, just because you thought, this is an easier way, but then you're not complying with the local jurisdictions where you're hiring the contractor from.
Yeah, exactly. Those misclassification lawsuits, paying back taxes and all that sort of thing is definitely something that companies want to avoid where they can. And maybe, one more question from the audience before we wrap. I'm going to do sort of my spin on it. Somebody's asking about sharing case studies, but I don't know. Do you have any kind of fun war stories of, discrepancies that you guys have found in interview processes screening processes that you can share?
So this is an interesting setup where the candidate actually asked the candidate's sibling to apply for the role.
Wow.
Right? So the original candidate have flags in terms of the criminal check. So the candidate asked the sibling who has a clean record, but then once the sibling actually passed the interview, got the job, since it was remote, it was the actual candidate who's now doing it. So when they run the rescreen and they had to do it out of compliance, that's when they find out, hey, this candidate isn't the same candidate we thought the candidate should be. Why is the date of birth different?
Yeah.
Good thing. And then if that role is handling cash, and then that candidate has a credit record, there's a high likelihood that there will be some creative ways to get money. That candidate would need it, because doing the credit check reveals that there's an issue there.
Interesting. It's funny. I have cousins in my family who are identical twins, and I remember them trying to take tests for each other when they were in grade school. But this is taking it to a whole different level where you're actually applying for a job and getting a job on behalf of a sibling. So that is interesting.
Yeah. You would think it doesn't happen, but it does happen, and you just want to mitigate that. If it's right.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, listen, thank you so much for addressing all of my questions, and I hope that everybody, enjoyed Jeremiah's perspective. And I do feel as though this is sort of an overlooked aspect of the hiring process in general, but such an incredibly essential part of adding new talent to your team, especially in the global context. And frankly, just thinking about all of the things that could go wrong if you don't do these types of checks. So that's why we've partnered with Verimark. We think that they are an excellent platform for people to leverage all different types of checks in 180 countries around the world, which is means that it can scale however you'd like it to. We recommend Verimark as a part of our process when we are hiring people on behalf of our clients, and so we would definitely encourage you to check them out. But again, Jeremiah, thank you for your time today. Thank you for the partnership with Verimark. Thanks everybody who took a few minutes out of their day to join us to discuss this topic. And we're going to have more webinars coming up on important topics as it relates to building a remote workforce. So again, thank you all. And we hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be.
Yeah. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremiah.